All right. Bad Faith crowd, faithful, if you will. I'm really thrilled to have, for the first time on Bad Faith podcast, Jessica Burbank. You may know her as a Friday co-host on Rising. You may know her from her viral TikTok explainers, where she is one of the best lefties on the platform, in my humble opinion, really compellingly explaining all of the things that we talk about for hours and hours on end on this podcast in a much more succinct manner. She has an MPA from Brown in data-driven policy, and was also an Iowa field coordinator for Bernie 2020. Is that right?
That's true. Yeah.
All right. Well, welcome to Bad Faith, Jessica. I can't believe it's taken us this long to get together on here.
But here we are. We finally did it.
All right. So there has been a lot going on in the lefty sphere. Let's start with talking about some of the most unexpected news in the electoral context. Cenk Uygur seemed to hint on breaking points last week, that he was so frustrated with the candidates that the Democrats were putting forward, that he was considering throwing his hat into the ring.
But so Cenk, tell me more about your thinking.
Yeah.
Timeline, what are you weighing? Right. How serious are you?
Yeah.
Give us the details.
So I already thought about it before, and I rejected it because I know what they're going to do. Mm-hmm. You're an outsider, radical. They're going to dredge up things from 1987 and when you were a junior in junior high school.
They already did that to you.
I think they did that to you already.
Yeah,
that's right.
Of course. And they're going to go to any outsider and shred him to pieces.
Sure.
And I'm now so desperate for making sure that we win that I think I'm already destroyed, right? Like they've already attacked me 10,000 times, right? So come at me, bro.
And some people have even speculated that the announcement that Nina Turner has been hinting at over the past month or two maybe has some relationship to throwing her hat in the ring, either as a candidate or as a vice presidential candidate alongside Cenk. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, I remember Nina Turner's concession speech, which was essentially like almost a campaign launch speech. Mm-hmm. It was so hopeful, so forward thinking. She mentioned we're coming for you in 2024. Mm-hmm. Does that mean she's running? Does that mean someone else is running? And then her social media accounts lately, it's a lot of big announcement coming. Stay tuned. Can Cenk run? It's my understanding he was born in Turkey, lived there, moved here when he was 8. So I've worked with Cenk Uygur. I will criticize Cenk in the same way I know he would criticize anyone else. You get a lot of press when you say you're running for president of the United States. Cenk's book is coming out. I am not so convinced that he would ever run for president again, especially after getting 6% of the vote in his congressional race. And I don't even know if he's eligible. So I'm not super bought into the Cenk Uygur running thing. I am bought into Nina Turner running in 2024.
So when you say you're bought into it, does that mean you think it's possible that it would happen? Or do you think you're actually supportive of it happening?
I think it's possible it will happen. I would want to know how Nina plans on running. I support Nina Turner for whatever she does. I would like to see her team up with Marianne Williamson or Cornel West in some way. Maybe we could see that happening. Maybe the big announcement is her working with Cornel West. I know they're both surrogates for the Bernie campaign. I don't know how close they are, but ideologically super aligned. It would make sense. Infrastructure-wise, I think the Green Party is the party that can support a presidential run more so than a lot of other political groups. I don't think the Green Party has been particularly good at communicating an ideological platform. They're a bit of a mixed bag, but they're really good at getting people on the ballot and having that electoral infrastructure. So I could see that happening. What about you? Are you thinking Cenk really means it when he says he's running again? What about Nina?
Well, no. I have heard that he has some theory as to why him not being born in the United States would not preclude him from running, but it feels untested and like conjecture. And while it feels uncharitable to say that people are doing things like this as stunts to sell their books, I don't think that that is an unrealistic assumption given what we know about the Constitution barring him from running. And the way that it came out in the Breaking Point segment, it felt kind of like he was being intentionally provocative. It didn't feel like an accidental slip of the tongue. And it also didn't feel like an impassioned case that he was making after being so deeply frustrated by what's been going on in the party. It felt kind of like, dare I say, a calculated drop to garner attention. I don't think it's really happening. Now, I would hope that Senator Turner, because I am broadly supportive of her and what she tries to do, would not align with Cenk on this. They have had this relationship through the Young Turks. She did have her show over there, and I think there was some simpatico around that. But I don't think it's a good look for her. And besides which, I just really wish there were more coordination happening among these left figures. I personally appreciate the value for the left being able to make an argument about the unfairness of the Democratic Party. That can only really be made if there is a left candidate who is being treated unfairly in the Democratic Party primary. So I do think that the Marianne Williamson campaign serves that important role, and therefore I appreciate it being separate and distinct from Cornel West's campaign. However, if you're now an additional leftist contemplating running in either a Democratic primary or a general election, it would seem to me that given that there's already kind of placeholders here, and given the desire not to further fracture the left, that you would either join up with Marianne or join up with Cornel West. There hasn't been a lot, I think, there hasn't been that much support coming out of Nina Turner just on social media for Marianne, which suggests to me, has been indicating to me that for some time that she might be considering her own run. But like, as a completely separate and different candidate than Cornel West in a general election with what party?
Mm-hmm. I think that's the question, yeah.
It would be hard for me to imagine. And then, so if the question is then, is she going to announce that she's going to be a VP? Well, I would expect that if that were the case, we would have gotten similar sorts of hints from the Cornel West camp, right? But it's only unilaterally Nina Turner hinting that something's coming out. So I don't know, maybe it's a congressional run. It could be any number of things, but for the sake of the left, I don't know. I don't know how much the left benefits from having another character in the theatrical production that is the 2024 race.
I agree. I think so much about just the org I worked for. I worked for one of these lefty nonprofits, right? And it seems that this isn't just this one nonprofit I worked for, which was People's Action, where at its founding, it was a lot of direct action. It was a lot of what's immediately impacting working class people. How can we center organizing and direct action around that? So I believe it was JP Morgan Chase was charging these overdraft fees that were extremely damaging. You're essentially making poor people pay for being poor, giving money to the bank because they don't have enough to even take care of themselves. It's ridiculous. And so everybody dressed up like Robin Hood and showed up to JP Morgan Chase headquarters. They showed up to the CEO's country club to make them uncomfortable, make them change this damaging policy. That direct action took like 20, 30 people, was extremely effective. You meet the exact actor that is responsible for the damaging policy where they're at. And they did end up changing that overdraft policy shortly afterwards. Why are we so focused on electoral organizing exclusively? It almost feels intentional to me that there's some actor that's like, what would be really fun is if we got this progressive movement that is committed to these radical ideas to spend all of their organizing energy on elections. That's where the funding is coming from. And I wouldn't be surprised if the funding was coming from people who aren't ideologically aligned with the progressive movement. And they want us to be focusing on electoral organizing so we don't do the stuff that we know is effective. We could use leaders in labor organizing, union organizing, and direct action. And so I don't know, it feels like almost intentional capture to me that so much of our organizing is electoral. So your point's well taken. Like, do we need all of our leaders and figures that are public facing with audiences to be doing this thing of let's run for public office and then we'll get in there and work with the establishment again? It just doesn't seem to be working.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I find most alluring about the idea of a Green Party Cornel West run was some of the early statements about how this was an opportunity to build labor capacity via the election. So the same way that there was a lot of hope that Bernie Sanders could get a lot of people in, under the tent, get them registered through all those, specialized Bernie apps, train people how to door knock, get people politically engaged in a movement that was supposed to last beyond the election cycles. I think that's valuable. And, you know, I was at a worker strike back event interviewing a whole panel full of people, but including Chris Hedges, when we kind of broke the news that Cornel West was considering joining up with the Green Party as opposed to the Movement for a People's Party. And part of the excitement in the room was the idea that he would be closely paired with groups like Worker Strike Back and other groups that are really focused on the grassroots organizing aspect of it. It's still early days. I don't want to count Cornel West out in his ability to do that. But, you know, especially given some recent news around Bernie Sanders and his choice to kind of, in the wake of the government funding debacle, tweet out that he really is hopeful that we're going to get more aid to Ukraine soon. You know, those kinds of moments make people stop and think, well, is this the same Bernie Sanders who was our anti-war advocate, who was talking about shrinking the defense budget, who we were willing to pledge all of our money and our time to, and who also chose to unwind his organization and endorse Biden like 5 days after he ended his campaign and do very little that was adversarial to the administration? I mean, if that's what happened to Bernie Sanders, am I really that hopeful about what's going to come out of the Cornel West campaign? And maybe that's not fair to Cornel West, but we really are coming off the back of a very dispiriting tweet out of Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, I think if the Bernie Sanders that went to Nicaragua and met with the Sandinistas met the Bernie Sanders that's tweeting about Ukraine funding today, they might have a lot to talk about. They might not know each other too well. And that's why I think it's useful to use elections to organize a movement. Can you create a long-term movement through election organizing? Maybe. But I think also organizing around ideas and showing that people power works independent of a candidate or political figure might be more useful, might be more long-term, might happen slower. But it might be worthwhile in the long run, because if you see then Bernie Sanders aligning himself with the Democratic Party, endorsing Joe Biden, there are a lot of people that came into the political process by way of Bernie Sanders that then saw how that went down, then became jaded and didn't want to be involved in politics at all ever again, or vote, or pay attention to what's going on in the news. That's really concerning. Are we burning people out with this way of thinking that organizing needs to happen? I think the conversation around, you know, the spoiler candidate stuff is useful because it exposes this fracture that is not talked about enough, where you think a third party candidate is going to pull votes away from Joe Biden or whoever the Democratic candidate is. Why are we talking about the 60% of people that are participating right now, and instead of the 40% that is not motivated to show up for the Democratic Party that might vote for a third party candidate? Like, I really think if they would blame Cornel West as a spoiler candidate, as destroying the chances for a Democrat to get in there or otherwise and have Trump become the president again, it just doesn't make any sense. What is the Democratic Party doing that they're not capturing some of that 40% that's entirely up for grabs? And so I think, you know, when we consider who's gonna build a long-lasting movement, it might be someone that's capturing that 40%, the people that are not voting right now and new voters. And so maybe we have to organize around ideas. Maybe we have to organize people together. What does that infrastructure look like on the left? A lot of people have said it should be rooted in the Labor Party, a new, you know, party entirely independent from the Green Party, a Labor Party that's aligned with the new labor movement, where we have worker-led worker organizing. Because what we see with a lot of these unions is the path dependency of people with established relationships with the Democratic Party who just have their membership essentially endorse the Democratic candidate that's running without asking for a lot of policies in exchange. Will you add, you know, raising the minimum wage to your platform? It used to be more of a conversation, and I think a lot of the big internationals are waking up to that. But I think there could be a new coalition around labor that's different from the one we've seen before. But I think it might mean not aligning yourself with the Green Party, because people have a particular imagination about what the Green Party is. And I really think if we're going to build like a multiracial working class movement, we've got to organize people around ideas more than around just these individual figures or existing infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, I agree and I disagree. I'm a little skeptical of the idea that the Green Party's branding is so fixed and so stuck and also so negative, when frankly it has so little kind of national traction in the first place. And also there's been little to no effort to do any kind of rebranding. And I'm a little hesitant to say we got to throw the baby out with the bathwater at this stage. I think I do agree insofar as I think the Green Party and any party that hopes to be a working class party needs to center labor and refer to itself, whether or not it's an explicitly like Labor Party in name, as a labor party. You can't, I mean, why do we want an environmentally forward party in the first place? It's partly because we want a just transition. We understand that the interests of workers and these environmental concerns are going lockstep and can't be ignored, as much as the Republicans are trying to make the kind of EV issue a wedge issue on these labor disputes. We've actually seen how robustly the UAW workers have been able to withstand that sort of divisiveness. And I do think you're completely right. When I look at how both major candidates are genuflecting to attract the interest and the support of those UAW workers, and how Donald Trump is willing to do this complete like fake rally in front of non-unionized workers, that suggests to me real power that labor is demonstrating at this moment. Forcing President Biden to the picket line for the first time in American history is a real win. Now, I am hopeful, I'm very hopeful that that doesn't become a reason to kind of prematurely endorse Joe Biden without getting some real commitments, including over the PRO Act, which many people sung Biden's praises over because he supported it, but then completely failed to fight for it in his first or second year in office when he had these congressional majorities. So that's all to say that I substantively agree with you about the idea that, you know, the current moment is demonstrating the immense power that labor has. Whether or not that's going to be funneled in any kind of real electoral kind of like party framework in the near future remains to be seen. But to your question about your comments about the third parties and independents, of course, the big news is that RFK Jr. is going to announce in a few days that he's going to run as an independent. First, I want to ask you, are you surprised with that news? And then I want to ask you, do you think that's good news or bad news for the left?
I'm really not surprised by that news. I remember watching Cenk Uyghur's interview in Breaking Points where he said, well, he's not really a Democrat anyway. Maybe that's true, right? He doesn't say a lot of the things that the Democrats say also or agree with. But people also said that about Bernie Sanders. That's not a reason to not vote for somebody. I'm not at all surprised. Because RFK Jr. seems to be the kind of guy that likes to thoroughly talk about issues with nuance. And that's opened up a big door for a lot of things he says to be taken out of context. And I'm not someone who would ever vote for RFK Jr. because in his heart of hearts, he's a capitalist. And I just disagree with continuing the way the American economy has gone. I think we need systemic change. RFK Jr. doesn't believe that. He's, out of the question for me. I say this as a criticism of American media, that they were so willing to take things out of context that he said because he was an outsider. And because he was someone that was willing to not stick to brief talking points that were pre-approved by his party consultants. He was willing to have hours-long conversations about issues with substance. And I think that really set him apart from other people. But the way the media destroyed him, it was clear the establishment hated him. And you really need the establishment on your side if you're going to win a primary. If there's one thing we've learned in recent years, it's that. And so it's not surprising. I'm not sure how it's going to go. I don't know if he's going to get media coverage necessary to sustain a campaign that will be meaningful in the general election.
See, I was a little surprised, if only because it seemed beyond obvious to me as a 2 times over Bernie broad that he wasn't going to get a fair hearing in the Democratic primary, right? It's part of why many of us were advocating for Marianne not to even run in the primary in the first instance. And when he was confronted about that in various interviews, both by myself, I know that Kim Iverson asked him about this like months ago. Like, how are you going to overcome the Democratic Party machine? Didn't you see what happened to Bernie? So it seemed like he should have known that he was up against this kind of Democratic Party that has said openly in court, as we all know from the 2016 lawsuits with Bernie, that they can pick and choose. We knew that there was going to be no debate. We knew they were going to change the order of the primary states. And in the face of all of that, he still seemed to be very committed to the idea of running as a Democrat, right? You say that he wasn't really a Democrat, but his website materials blare. I'm a Kennedy. I'm a Democrat. I'm from a family of Democrats. We're classic Democrats. I mean, he really wears that label proudly. Unlike Bernie Sanders, who was like, well, I'm a Democrat. I'm an independent from Vermont who happens to caucus with Democrats, but he never really wanted to like cling to the banner of being a Democrat in name. And so I guess I'm glad he's come around to the idea, but a part of me is like, what was your analysis beforehand? Are you really so brand new in your thinking that you are only going to shift gears apparently in response to how you've been treated when it was obvious how you were going to be treated this whole time? Whether or not it's a good thing or a bad thing, I'm mixed. So there is this poll. This came out, an American Values poll conducted by Zogby Strategies of likely general election voters. It shows that in a three-way race between Kennedy, Trump, and Biden, RFK enters the contest at 19%, with Biden and Trump at 38% each. Kennedy would be the highest polling independent or third-party candidate to enter a presidential election in the modern era, starting off where Ross Perot finished after spending an enormous amount of money. I've seen additional polls showing that Biden is faring much worse with independents in this cycle as compared to how he fared in 2020. Basically, their numbers, Trump and his numbers with independents being flipped from where they were in 2020. And that really made the difference for Biden back then, which does not bode well. And then there's this additional question of whether or not RFK then further contributes to that by pulling more or fewer votes from Republicans versus Democrats. And in terms of favorability polls, those suggest that RFK Jr. is more favorable among Republicans than Democrats. Might that mean that ultimately his presence in the race hurts Trump and ultimately helps Biden?
Yeah, I think I would side with that argument. I can see RFK Jr. I mean, he went on Joe Rogan's podcast. He's the kind of guy that really relates to men, white working class men, people who are critical of the media and skeptical of the government. That's a huge group of people that are super unlikely, I think, to go for Democrats this time around. And it begs the question, if Cornel West is in the question in a major way when it comes to 2024, can he make the argument that in order to change our economy so that it's not rigged for corporations and working people have more power and are paid fair wages and we begin to set things right, can he make that case to white working class voters that have been so skeptical of every single message, the type of voters that see Joe Biden as a far left kind of a guy? Can we communicate the kind of New Deal policy that's necessary to address climate change in a meaningful way as something that is good for all working people? I think like that is the big question around Cornel West or anyone making a meaningful run on the left, is like, can we reach the working class people? And I don't mean working class in the sense of excluding the middle class. I mean people who have to work to pay their bills, which does include the middle class. Like, can we win over those people with a candidate that can make the case to them that voting for a New Deal type of a policy, voting for a job guarantee, is not something that is exclusive to a brand of leftism that they've been sold by the media, that is somehow bad for the economy, that actually it is good for the economy to have a job guarantee, that we're leaving productive capacity on the table by not reaching full employment, and the current way of running things only benefits the elites. It's a complicated argument to make because of the existing narratives that are fed to people. And so I can see a world where if a candidate effectively can make that point and send that message, they could even capture some of that 19% that RFK is getting. And I think the big question is like, who's going to be able to do that and how? Is it going to be grassroots? Is it going to be media? What will the message sound like? Will it be different from any kind of campaign we've seen before? I think that's why candidates like Cornel and Nina Turner excite me.
Yeah, I mean, I would love it if that were the case from Cornel West. I will say, as much as I personally love to hear Dr. West speak, I do wonder if there needs to be a rhetorical shift from him away from some of the more kind of jazz-infused academic lingo that he tends to use, which, like, really, truly, I love as like a listener and someone who shares his politics, and as someone who is entertained by him and who learns from him in a kind of academic way. I'm not sure that he is if that rhetorical strategy is concretely telling the story that he needs to tell that you've just described. And I also haven't seen a ton of evidence that RFK Jr. is interested in telling that kind of story. But the thing about RFK Jr. is we have gotten a very skewed vision of what he sounds like on the stump because the outlets that have chosen to platform him to date have largely been these conservative leading outlets that have platformed him in part because they benefit from elevating someone who wants to knock at Biden, which again, I'm not criticizing, but there are, the Elon Musks of the world, and the Bill Maher's of the world. I mean, Bill Maher is a Biden guy, but the kind of like anti-woke, politically incorrect crew that has really been singing RFK Jr.'s praises, when they have him on, they're not asking him about workers' rights and they're not asking him about the environment. They're asking him about vaccine policy and they're asking him about kind of woke authoritarian overreach type stuff, like First Amendment stuff. So, the second that he is now running in a way that can challenge the Republicans, are these kind of right-leaning outlets still going to want to lift him up if that hurts Trump? And moreover, if he's running more freely and going on more kinds of outlets, is he going to start talking about his full agenda in a way that actually turns off some of his Republican-leaning, conservative-leaning base of support? We saw what happened when he came out in favor of student debt cancellation and he did a tweet about it. He got like dragged by all of his fans who seem to have like temporarily forgotten that he is in fact a Democrat.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how the label of Democrat means something different to everyone. Like to RFK Jr., it's a family thing. Everyone in my family was a Democrat. Mm-hmm. It's a cultural thing. Mm-hmm. To many people, it's a policy thing. It's a very real thing. What does the party believe in right now? What's the platform? What's the infrastructure? Organizing in Oklahoma for the Bernie Sanders campaign, you really realize that political affiliation has next to nothing to do with policy. Mm-hmm. It's such a family and cultural thing. The title means something. It's who you hang out with, who you know. And it's these vague values. Like, especially when you draw the line between conservative and liberal. Conservatives are people who think, just maybe taxes are a little bit too much. They're thinking of that in the context of being a small business and how it's difficult to operate a small business and pay the tax rate that is there, right? They're like a little bit less taxes, the economy would be great. It's not political thinking far beyond their parochial interests. That is why I think language is so important, because that kind of a conservative that votes Republican probably agrees with all of our criticisms about how the economy benefits the corporate and capitalist class. They would benefit from our kind of economic vision. So obviously it's a communication problem, but it's also this cultural problem of the entrenchment of this tribal identity with a particular political party that's like totally at play here. But I think you make a good point about Cornel West. And that's why I think like language is the most important thing. We've had so many conversations on the left as to why the Democratic Party, which, many of us don't consider to be the left, but we care about the Democratic Party to a certain degree. But, we're quite unhappy with them attracting non-working class folks, people who have high incomes, people who have college degrees. Why? I would just identify language as the main problem. Why are our spokespeople speaking at a level that most people don't speak at in their day-to-day conversations? It doesn't make any sense from a communications perspective. If you care at all about winning over the electorate, your number one concern should be, can they understand what I'm saying? And I think so many people in American politics are speaking past each other. It might be like the determinant factor between who wins an election is just who's speaking in terms most people can understand. And what they understand is that actually what you're trying to communicate is another layer there. I think Nina Turner uniquely is probably the orator of our generation. She communicates extremely well to large groups of people and excites them and uses words they can understand. I would be more hopeful of her creating a coalition of working class people than I would be Cornel West for that reason alone.
Yeah, I mean, I do recall being so uplifted by her on the campaign trail in particular. I don't think I've ever seen someone be an opener or be on the stump and be so compelling even as I was listening to her making basically the same remarks over and over again, like repeatedly during the Bernie campaign, there were times when you'd like want to just leave the room because you've heard it before and like go take care of your business and send emails or whatever, and then come back when you're on again. But when Senator Turner would speak, I would want to listen to it every single time. There was something that was very authentic. The emotional resonance of it felt really real. And sometimes I think the left talks about these things as though like this person's a PMC and that person's not a PMC. Basically, everyone we're talking about, Trump, Bernie, Cornel West, all of these people went to top tier schools. I mean, people forget that Bernie went to the University of Chicago. Donald Trump, attended Wharton and Harvard and all of these schools as well. It's not necessarily about that, but there's a kind of, I think, directness and honesty, even as Donald Trump is lying this way, that you can be saying something that's so obviously what you're not supposed to be saying that it comes across as authentic. Mm-hmm. And Biden even has a little bit of that too. Like, I'm not being facetious. Listen, fat, they told me not to say this, but I'm saying it anyway. He like loves those sorts of refrains.
Sorry, I'm Irish. My bad.
Right? Exactly. You remember, they told me not to say that I personally freed Nelson Mandela from prison, but it's a great story and I'm going to tell it anyway. I mean, that's part of why people think that he comes off as authentic, even when he's literally lying. Mm-hmm. So I think there definitely is something to that. Speaking of people who once came across as authentic, who have maybe sold the left downriver, I wonder what you make of the reactions of members of the squad to this latest iteration of the never-ending force the vote saga. And by that, I mean this vote over the weekend for a continuing resolution to fund the government, avoids a government shutdown. Top line, it is largely a status quo bill, but it included some disaster relief funding and notably did not include any Ukraine funding. That's what Bernie was reacting to in the tweet we were discussing earlier when he tweeted, quote, "I look forward to seeing Congress provide in the very near future financial support for Ukraine, which is valiantly struggling against Russian aggression." And in response to Kevin McCarthy getting this CR passed, the Freedom Caucus, led by Matt Gaetz, is threatening to use some of the power that they got during the Force the Vote debacle in the beginning of this year to instigate a motion to vacate and kick Kevin McCarthy out of the leadership position. And the Democrats are split on whether or not they would vote against Kevin McCarthy or vote to keep Kevin McCarthy. Some of the Democrats have been saying they'll follow the lead of Hakeem Jeffries, but Ilhan Omar in a recent interview said that she's very much looking forward to voting Speaker McCarthy out of the leadership position.
I think I know the answer to this question, but I want to ask you quickly. I know that Matt Gaetz has been reaching out to folks in the House. Has he reached out to you?
I've chatted with Matt, both on the floor and off the floor.
And can you let us in on any of your conversations that you've had with regards to this motion to vacate, Congresswoman?
I mean, look, Matt is interested in bringing this motion to vacate because he says McCarthy has lied and broken the promises that he made to Matt and others in order to become a speaker. We all know that there have been multiple members within the Republican conference that have said similar things, that McCarthy is untrustworthy, his word doesn't mean anything. And if you know anything about this business of governing, your word has to mean something. I mean, I recently had a conversation with Matt where he said you can only be lied to so much before you allow yourself to be taken for a fool. And what I said to him back was, with Pelosi, you always knew where she stood. Her word was bond. And it has to be unfortunate to have a leader whose word you can't trust, whose direction you can't follow because you don't know what direction they are going to take you. There are too many promises that McCarthy has made. He's made a deal with the devil, as I said, multiple times. And, now he has to figure out a way to save himself.
So with all that in mind, Congresswoman, do you get on board with this motion to vacate, or do you help protect Speaker McCarthy?
Well, personally, I can't wait to take the vote to vacate. You know, I think it's not a surprise to anyone that McCarthy and I have our own issues, but it is essentially an issue of governance. We know that McCarthy has not been able to contain his conference. We know that he has not been able to keep the promises that he's made to Leader Jeffries, to the president, to Majority Leader Schumer when it comes to the spending budgets that we had to pass in the last couple of months to fund our government. We know this is a man who's interested only in his speakership and not really governing on behalf of the country. Only when it became too politically poisoned did he decide to do a clean CR in order to avoid a shutdown on the 11th hour, with only giving us maybe 5-minute notice. That's why we were scrambling yesterday to try to figure out what was actually in the CR. Was it as clean as he said? Is it something that we can pass? And so when you have a speaker like that, that can't be trusted, whose word you can't understand or, trust, it becomes easy. It doesn't have to be personal. I know McCarthy keeps saying for Matt, it's personal. He'll probably say that for some of the Democrats who have been out there saying he should no longer be speaker, that it's personal. But it really is a question of governance.
So you're yes on a motion to vacate, just to be clear.
Yes, ma'am.
This does seem to be another one of these referendums on whether or not the progressives have the cojones to really be adversarial to the Democratic Party. And the fact that so many of them are bragging in this moment about having kind of solidarity as Democrats, as opposed to using their leverage to agitate for ways, agitate for gains the way that the Freedom Caucus is agitating, is frustrating others. And I wonder what you make of this scene.
Yeah, especially with the McCarthy vote. What's going to happen? They don't have an alternative candidate. The Republicans, I think they're going to go through a long process again and ultimately potentially end up reelecting McCarthy. I'm not really sure. They don't have a viable alternative, but it's interesting to see which members of the squad are using their seat and their voice in Congress to be the political agitator that we all hoped they would be. Mm-hmm. I used to say that they promised us that they would be. I don't know that we ever got that promise. When I think about AOC's initial run, being from the tri-state area, AOC claims the Bronx and Queens a lot. AOC went to high school in Yorktown, in Westchester, at a school that's in the top 10% of schools in the state and the country, that is 30% minority and only 10% economic disadvantage. I went to a high school that was also in the tri-state area, 45 minutes outside of Manhattan, and it was 70% minority, 52% economic disadvantage. When I think about what it means to be working class from that area, I think AOC had a really different upbringing from all of the working class people that identified with that campaign and believed in her. And I think that plays a huge role into how she's decided to use her seat in Congress. I really think your upbringing means so much, because when you feel that your family is on the brink of bankruptcy, homelessness, every single political issue, you really see it for what it is. For most people, it feels like life or death. Most people are living in survival mode. And so when we see the squad, who we expected to fight for us with that same veracity, really, making the case for change with the kind of potency that the political issues are felt in our day-to-day lives, like real material problems. We just aren't getting that from them. And I look back at their campaigns and their run, that's what we all wanted, but I don't know if AOC ever promised that to me or anybody. So they might just be doing what they intended to do, which was to work within the system, push the conversation a little bit, get some stuff done, make a career for themselves, when we want, and I think need, real agitators in Congress. And so it's good that Ilhan is saying, I plan on not voting with party lines. But I think I and a lot of people had a real reckoning when it was like AOC's first day getting sworn in and she voted for Nancy Pelosi as speaker. I was expecting at least some kind of contention there, at least some kind of, no, I won't vote for Nancy Pelosi. So I'm disappointed, but not surprised.
Well, but here's the thing. AOC did say while she was running, before she got into office, that, you know, there should be, first of all, she said, I don't, in any normal country, I wouldn't be in the same party as Joe Biden. I'm fairly confident, she said, there's no reason that a progressive should be voting for someone like Nancy Pelosi. Now, that's, I think, before they had the narrow margins where her vote was actually going to make a difference. But she said something along those lines. She said she would rather be a one-term Congress member than someone that betrayed her values. And the Justice Democrats, specifically the people who founded that organization that recruited her and ran her, Kyle Kulinski has said that the whole point of what the Justice Democrats were doing was to have a genuinely adversarial presence in Congress. And that first day of her being in office, when she is joining the sit-in in Nancy Pelosi's office that was orchestrated by the Sunrise Movement, seemed to suggest that that was the kind of person she was going to be. But in reality, even if that was her plan, it looks like Nancy Pelosi mama beared them all into submission. You know, Politico reported on her taking them all out to dinner and exerting whatever pressure or threat worked. Whatever Pelosi said to AOC on the House floor that made her cry that day over the Iron Dome bill. I wish AOC would have come to us and talked to us about it and supported or had some faith that the left was going to have her back. But instead, she continues to keep their secrets and seems to believe, in good faith or bad, that working within the system is going to yield more results for her community than being the person that I think she did say she was going to be when she was running for office. But what's so, I think, dispiriting in this instance is that there's still, because the media doesn't try to hold any of these people accountable because they're not actually aligned with us as leftists, they can openly brag about not being adversarial at a moment when the squad of the right is being adversarial and not get any flack for it in the mainstream. And moreover, as much as I have no identity of interest with the Freedom Caucus's goals, the fact that they're the ones that managed to get a continuing resolution that eliminates Ukraine funding, while Bernie Sanders was out here tweeting that we will hopefully be able to get separate Ukraine funding. And that there is absolutely no, as much as the majority of Republicans are still very much pro-war, that there is no similar cohort as the Freedom Party on the left that is willing to at all question the volume even of the funding to Ukraine while any number of domestic disasters are ongoing, is a real indictment of those squad members, even the best of them, which I would say Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib.
Yeah. I think it's this principle that most leftists believe in, that there's power in numbers, and that organizing is all about there being a group of people that is loud and effective and organized together and leverages the power they have for the change that they want to see. There's like no principles that their campaigns were based in that say like, oh, well, maybe incrementalism is fine and like we'll work with the establishment. And so I am curious as to what happens where that mentality changes, where you don't see yourself as an organizer still, even though you're a member of Congress. It's not that you're someone writing federal legislation during the day and then beyond the doors of Congress, you get to be an organizer. You need to carry your values and organizing mentality with you in Congress. I think, yeah, it makes sense that, you know, coming out of Justice Democrats, that we did believe AOC would be that in Congress. We did believe that the squad would be agitators in Congress and would use their power, even if it's not much, you know, when it comes to actually getting what they want votes wise. Do we have a majority to do something? No. But I think that there's some power in at least making it a part of the political conversation, because that's what the Freedom Caucus did. They proved that it's effective to dissent and to demand things and to organize and to bring attention to issues and get their constituents talking about them and get media attention for the issues. And I think so many policies that the left supports, that progressive supports, are popular among most people, but the media doesn't give them a lot of attention. So if we were to actually force members of Congress to make decisions on those issues and explain why they are voting against them, that is an effective organizing tool in itself to get the ends you want, even if you don't think you're going to get the majority and have it passed. So I want to know, like, what has changed in their mentality? Are they comfortable with their job in DC and their income? Is this a lifestyle that they like? And so that's why they're changing their behavior. Something has changed. And I think it's not that they are now enlightened that working together is the way to get things done, because the Freedom Caucus and organizing as a whole proves that you can get more things done with organizing, arguably.
I mean, to your point about kind of the spotlighting specific issues that the public is behind. I mean, one of the wins of the Freedom Caucus in the initial fight over the speakership back in January was that they won more single subject bills to be voted on, which allow members to vote on specific narrow issues instead of 1,000-page pork barrel behemoths. That's a summary that I'm reading, I guess, from the Post, from the time. Now, I saw an interview, I think it was between Jake Tapper and Matt Gaetz. I could be wrong. Just recently, following this whole debacle over the weekend. And Jake Tapper, whoever the cable news pundit was characterizing votes on single issue bills as a bad thing that Republicans want to be able to basically vote down social spending that they don't like, that's normally lumped into a broader spending bill that they have to basically capitulate over because otherwise the government shuts down. And while I certainly think that that's going to be true in some instances, given that there's that 2014 Princeton study that we all bring up all the time that shows how huge the gap is between what Congress is willing to support and what Congress actually votes on, I can't help but think that that's going to cut both ways. Yes, there's going to be some stuff that maybe doesn't have popular support over, let's say, some cultural issue or another that fails. But also, are we going to finally get our up-down vote on Medicare for all, which 88% of Democrats and 49% of Republicans support? Are we going to have squad members having an opportunity to make the case to small businesses, as you were bringing up before, that one of their biggest expenses is healthcare for their employees and what a boon it would be for them to no longer have that on their plate? Are we going to have up-down bills on child poverty and a $15 minimum wage, something that was so popular that it passed with 60% on the ballot in Florida in 2020, in a state that Trump won on the same ballot? You know, I can't help but think that that is a benefit. And speaking of issues that the public likes, that Congress does not, student debt is one of them. And we are recording this on the day that the student debt payments restart. This is something that Biden described as a high priority back in 2021, restarting the payments. And while he certainly did not have to restart the payments just because the Supreme Court struck down his student debt relief, he did, in fact, make that a priority. And now during an election year, after inducing millions of Americans to the polls by promising them student debt cancellation right before midterms last year, he is now responsible for turning the spigot back on after 3 years, where Donald Trump can claim credit for turning the spigot off in the first instance. Many borrowers are realizing that even the, let's say, more progressive aspects of Biden's plan, the SAVE Act, the kind of income-based repayment improvements are not in fact working because the website is down and the calculations aren't calculating. You know, what do you make of both the political decision here and this question of whether or not Joe Biden did this on purpose?
Yeah, I think the political decision it's a big one. I like that you tie this into the typical bills we get, especially around the budget, of their pork barreled. So you have all these members of Congress playing team sports. The Democrats want X thing in there, the Republicans want X thing in there, and so they make a trade. If we were to vote on individual spending in the way that Matt Gaetz described it, I don't know why Jake Tapper would criticize that as being good for Republicans. It's good for democracy because then we have real votes and substantive conversations about issues and public programs piece by piece, and your representatives will more likely vote in the direction of their constituents rather than the kind of typical vote trading we have when we have these big stopgap bills like the one they just passed. Imagine if members of Congress had to actually vote on student debt forgiveness. Imagine if they had to present their arguments on the floor for why they were for and against it. I really think the political decision to have student loan debt repayment start is absurd. The fact that they didn't have this pretty well advertised. They talked about it a lot. You know, we have the SAVE plan. You can have income-based repayment, which for many people, even if they were paying $250 to $400 a month, they're still struggling to make ends meet with that payment. There's this conversation, I know you've seen it, Brie, on Twitter, where it's like, this isn't even, you know, that much money. Most people aren't paying that much in student loan debt. The people that are complaining about this are the rich elites. No, they are very clearly rich elites if they think $250 to $400 a month is a simple and easy expense to pay. That's just ridiculous. But that goes to show that the people that are having this conversation are not the people affected by the issue. They're likely not people who ever had to struggle to pay off student loan debt. And so the working class is really poorly represented on this issue. And so if Biden were to have probably, you know, one or two consultants be people who were from working class backgrounds, they could very easily tell him this. But I think if his campaign promise was to forgive student loan debt, and he really genuinely wanted student loan debt repayment, we wouldn't have this situation where he first attempted it through the HEROES Act, which many people predicted would not be sufficient legal grounds for it to pass, right? It had to be a national emergency for the HEROES Act to work in this case because it would give the secretary power to waive student loans or any, you know, lien or right of redemption during a national emergency. That being COVID-19 was something I think a lot of people could have called into question by the time a case was brought before the Supreme Court. The case was weird because you had all of these states, 6 states, suing on behalf of student loan servicers, saying that they would be injured by the policy, which is ridiculous because when the student loan debt servicers were questioned, they were like, we didn't want to sue. Missouri being the only state that had a state-affiliated student loan debt servicer, they could actually claim injury. And so that's what ended up getting this case to be the thing that took down Biden's student loan forgiveness or debt cancellation plan. That's just an absurd chain of events. When you have the Higher Education Act of 1965, clear as day, there have been multiple studies done by many legal scholars into the language and the precedent saying, okay, this does give the Secretary of Education the right to waive any lien, right, title, right of redemption, student loans. And they just decided not to rely on that. They just decided, you know what, there's legal grounds for doing this. We're not going to pursue that. It would take several months to a year for them to meet with stakeholders as required and consider it and come up with the process. They don't even need consensus. They just need to go through the process, hear comments, etc., before they pursue the plan. Biden, the day that the Supreme Court struck this down, could have said, okay, this is what we're doing. We're pursuing it. We're going to move forward with, you know, extending student loan repayment pause until we get this process done. Let's extend it for a year. That could have been the administration's plan, but it wasn't, which shows that he's absolutely not genuine when he says he wants to cancel student loan debt. This means tested policy of you need to be a Pell Grant recipient to receive this amount or whatever to receive this amount, maximum $20,000. It's absurd, especially when you consider the circumstances in which people took on debt. We didn't have any of these schools increase the quality of education. And if you look at the balance sheets of these schools, I was looking at Washington University today, the amount of cash they have on hand and money they have in investments, it's almost like they're sitting on their cash in anticipation of a policy to make public school free so that they just have all of this money to continue operating. The high tuition that we're paying isn't even money that's spent in the duration that we're at the school. They've been pocketing it and hoarding it. It's literally absurd.
Yeah. I mean, again, I'm not the poster child for this, so take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. But Harvard's endowment, which is the largest, is almost $50 billion, which is larger than the GDP of Bolivia, Paraguay, Sierra Leone, richer than companies like General Motors, Coca-Cola, et cetera, et cetera. The idea that any of their students have debt should be an embarrassment to the institution. But here we are. I do think that you made a really good point that I do just want to highlight, that if you had a good faith investment in your Justice Department being able to fight the Supreme Court, relitigate this under the Higher Education Act instead of the HEROES Act, then you would want to preserve the status quo for debtors instead of making them start repayment. If you really thought this will be resolved in good faith in my administration's favor, why would you want to return your voters to the desperate status quo that they were in prior to Trump's instigating the student debt moratorium? And so I really do think it speaks to the bad faith of the administration that they announced well in advance of the Supreme Court's outcome that it was their priority to get payments to restart. And I do think it speaks to potentially his tighter relationships with the donor class that got him elected than with the constituents that he still relies on to reelect him going into next year. In slightly lighter fare, as we wrap up, many people have pointed to the Congress's disinterest in debating issues like, should we have child poverty again, or should we just allow it to double? Well, they have an ample appetite for instituting rules the dress code for John Fetterman. And also now there's this newfound appetite to trying to federally charge Jamal Bowman for boneheadedly ringing this fire alarm over the weekend. Republicans are arguing that he did it intentionally to stop the vote on the budget bill that he was in favor of, voted for, and successfully passed. I don't think that makes a lot of sense. I also don't think his logic for why he pulled the bell make a lot of sense. But let me get your final thoughts weighing in on both Fetterman outfit gate and Doorgate. Let's start with Fetterman. Should there be a dress code?
Yeah, I don't care. I don't care what members of Congress wear. I think it's ridiculous that most men wear suits in the first place. We have these designated uniform outfits for men to wear. They can't even pick out their own size. They have to get measured by somebody else. But it's all the same thing.
It's misandry. Poor men.
They have a uniform. It's kind of cute that it's like, oh, we don't trust you to dress yourself. Society has decided like you have a little uniform for men to wear in a professional or formal setting. And it's the same, professional and formal. I think it's about time, men have a little more freedom in how they dress because, the women members of Congress have to cover up probably more than necessary according to the old dress code. I think that's a bit ridiculous. That's outdated. Women have had some more freedom than men in that respect. But I don't care if a member of Congress is in, gym shorts. Ted Cruz showed up to a vote in running gear, still sweaty with one of his aides. That photo, I think a lot of people replied to Fetterman in his sweatsuit on the floor of Congress with Ted Cruz wearing something similar to the floor of Congress. To me, it's not a big deal. I think about like tech firms doing away with formal dress. It just seems that times are changing when it comes to clothes. And so it makes sense that Congress does it as well. A lot of people are very concerned about it, up in arms. They're like, why do I have to wear a certain thing, but members of Congress don't? And that's a good question. I think workers should maybe organize around that. The Jamal Bowman fire alarm thing, I don't know. He was like, I was tired. The door was locked. I thought it might unlock the door. I don't know what was going on in his head. I mean, I've been tired and done some ridiculous stuff before, just like pulling the wrong thing, pouring something with the top still on. They were in there for a while. Who knows what he was doing before? Maybe he was sleepy. But yeah, I don't think it was something malevolent. I don't think he should be charged for it. I think that's ridiculous.
So some people were coming to his defense, talking about the fact that there was this arguably unclear sign on the door that let me see if I can pull it up really quick. That said, okay, emergency exit only, push until alarm sounds, in parentheses, 3 seconds, door will unlock in 30 seconds. So the sign seems to indicate fully that an alarm is going to sound, but also that ultimately you can get the door to unlock. And so if you just didn't care that the alarm was going to sound and you really urgently felt like the fastest way to get to a vote that you very much needed to attend, I can see doing the cost benefit analysis and saying, I'm willing to break this law in order to get my vote in. And then you got to just deal with the consequences. My most charitable read, and I've been thinking about this even since we talked about it on Rising this morning, as a New Yorker, there are times when you live in an apartment building where there's not technically roof access, and there will be a sign on the door leading to the roof at the top of the stairwell that says, don't open, alarm will sound. But everybody in the building knows that there is going to be no alarm and we all use the roof. Like, we've all experienced it. Like, not every door that says it's going to ring an alarm is going to ring an alarm.
I also immediately thought of a subway station when it's busy. Do we go through the turnstiles?
Yes.
We don't go through the emergency exit. So as someone who spent a lot of time in New York, as Jamal Bowen being a New Yorker, the emergency exit sometimes fair option. It does say an alarm will sound, and then it doesn't in the subways as well. So
exactly. So, like, I said this morning that the Occam razor of a Congress member doing a dumb thing is most likely just that they're dumb. Like, that's the likeliest explanation. And I think it's dumb. And it's also kind of a hilarious story. Like, if you watch the video of him like flinging the sign to the side, like after, like, it's hilarious and he deserves to be ridiculed for it. I don't think criminally prosecuted for it. But I do believe in the less nefarious explanation for his behavior. Yeah.
It's almost a Cuomo. I'm not a pervert. I'm Italian. I'm not dumb. I'm a New Yorker.
Exactly. Oof, what is going on with these New York politicians? Okay. The clothing thing, I am somewhat sensitive to the argument that there is a respect issue with respect to how you dress in certain environments. I am open to the idea that, like, and I don't know if this is just a little bit of cultural conservatism that sneaks into my own upbringing, where I was raised to dress more formally, like business casual when on a plane. I am hyper aware of when I go shopping, if I want to expect a certain level of service, then I should dress well. I don't really wear sweatpants in public under any circumstances. Part of that is wrapped up in my feelings about how I'm going to be perceived as a Black woman on top of everything else. But I also have had the experience of like being complimented by flight attendants in an airport saying, thank you for dressing like that. Like, you look nice. Like, it's nice to like be serving people on a plane that don't look like they just rolled out of bed. And I'm sensitive to the idea that you can show respect for people at their workplace, as their job is to help you in an environment like on a plane, by like having a basic standard of like put togetherness, not fancy, just clean and like not pajamas. But to regulate, like, that's different than saying that I think there should be rules about it. I do think that what you choose to do out of your own personal sense of how to respect an environment should be different from necessarily mandating it. And I do think on some level the people of Pennsylvania spoke when they elected John Fetterman that they didn't feel like it was disrespectful for him to dress the way that he does, or at least they don't care about that as much as they care about the policies that he supports, and that it's going to be up to everyone in Congress. It should just be up to everyone in Congress to have that relationship with their constituents, and whether or not they find it to be disrespectful or they don't. And that is what it is. Yeah.
I grew up in a household where my Italian American mother would be like, all right, are you going to get ready to go? And I'd be like, Mom, like, I'm ready. And she's like, oh. I'm like, is it fine that I go like this? And she's like, yeah, if that's what you want to wear in public, go ahead. So it is something that's, I think in my experience, governed by social norms more than mandated rules. I like that distinction.
Yeah. Speaking of, I'm curious, I don't know anything about kind of you personally or how you got into politics and became so successful in some of these spaces, especially on TikTok, which is still the wild, wild west for me. Like, where you said you're from New York. When did you start like dabbling in media?
Oh yeah, I grew up like 45 minutes outside of the city, but technically Connecticut, the part that sticks out, in Stamford. And grew up in a working class family. Parents didn't go to college. I went to trade school. I didn't care about regular classes. I was like, well, I'm not going to college anyway. Doesn't matter. Was in the FFA. Started doing a little bit of public speaking about like Monsanto, corporate farming. And then from there, one of my closest friends was like, oh, you should join the debate team and the mock trial team. And I was like, I am not the type of person that's going to do that stuff. And she convinced me, and it ended up going well. And I ended up really liking it and got like a leadership scholarship to a school, Wells College, a tiny school. But I was, for the most part, on like a track to, be an analyst. I thought I wanted to go to law school, and I was bartending a lot to pay the bills. And then my advisor was like, you should go to grad school. Went to grad school for public policy. And that kind of like broke my brain a lot about, okay, it's not that we just can't figure out how to give people nice things. It's that like we're intentionally rigging policy and the economy so that working class people don't have nice things. And that was crazy to learn as someone who grew up during the financial crisis. My dad was a carpenter. He built homes for a living, but we were at risk of losing our home while the bankers at Wall Street were getting bailed out. It just like didn't make sense. And so it started to make sense in grad school. And then I was like, well, I don't want to make policy anywhere because no one's making good policy. So that's when I just left it all behind and worked for the Bernie campaign. And it's interesting because you were the first person I remember seeing you as the press secretary that I like looked up to in media, that I was like, oh, like she is explaining things in a way that like everyday working people can understand, that my family can understand. And I was like, that is so cool and so important. And I remember like I was on the organizing team, knocking doors, making phone calls. And I remember like using arguments the way you said them in nightly news, like with working class people, just like on the doors in meetings, on phone calls. But we all had to go home. Like we had to stop organizing, no more events because of the pandemic. And Bernie dropped out. And I was like, oh, like I just miss like having those important conversations with working class people. And I was on TikTok a lot. So I just like randomly posted one about how people were saying the government printed too much money and it's causing inflation. And it ended up getting like 150,000 views. And I was like, social media is so easy. Like I can do this. It's not easy, but I just kept doing it. But it was super random and organic.
Well, I mean, that's very humbling to hear that I was at all a model for your work, because I am an admirer of yours and I think you're just great. And I love having you on Rising in the Left chair on the days when I'm not there. And I'm hopeful that one day, perhaps in the very near future, they'll let us have a double left chair day so we can actually host the show together and hopefully one day in person together. Until then, let the good people, the good listeners of Bad Faith, know where they can find you on the internet and beyond.
Yes. TikTok, Ka Burbank, K-A Burbank. That's where most of the stuff is.
All right. Thank you again, Jessica. You're great. I really enjoyed talking to you today.
Yeah, this was awesome. I'm so glad we could finally do this.
All right. And for those who listen to Bad Faith Podcast, you probably already are aware that to get an extra episode every week, you can subscribe at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month. You can get an additional Monday episode to your free Thursday episodes. I hope you enjoyed this one as much as I did. And I hope you're not too mad at me about Monday's premium episode where I invited an astrologer on to have a little fun. Some of you, I think, need to loosen up a little bit and realize that we have a community here of diverse interests and that not everything has to be so egg brain serious all the time. I really enjoyed doing that episode as much as I did this one, and I am looking forward to seeing you next Monday. Take care of yourselves and keep the faith. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.